Hello and welcome to the M.B.Om podcast, where you'll learn to master the business of yoga. M.B.Om is a proud part of the Wander Barn Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Amanda Kingsmith. I'm a 500-hour registered yoga teacher, a yoga business coach, and a total business geek. Here at M.B.Om, you'll learn everything you need to know to create a sustainable yoga business by learning from myself and guests from around the world about how they built their yoga businesses, and about how you too can become a successful yoga teacher, studio owner, and much more. All right, let's dive in. Hey friends, I just wanted to pop in and talk a little bit about M.B.Om behind the scenes. When I entered the yoga world as a teacher, I was surprised by how many yoga teachers were struggling with the business side of yoga. And that's why I created M.B.Om. M.B.Om helps yoga teachers and studio owners become entrepreneurs. It helps you to go from surviving to thriving with your yoga business. I am on a mission to change the yoga industry, to teach yoga teachers and studio owners about the business of yoga, and to help you feel more confident, successful, and abundant. After releasing hundreds of podcast episodes, I want to create content that dives deeper into helping yoga entrepreneurs thrive and elevate their businesses. This is where M.B.Om Behind the Scenes comes in. Each week, you will get bonus content from the weekly guest or myself, diving deeper into how you can take the teachings and apply them to your business. This podcast is designed for yoga teachers and studio owners who are ready to take it to the next level. If you enjoy M.B.Om and have been looking for an affordable way to learn more, this is it. For the cost of 2 lattes per month, you will get never-before-heard content that you can't access anywhere else that will give you tangible ways to dive deeper into your yoga business. If this sounds like something you're interested in, let's dive in. Head on over to patreon.com/MBM yoga and sign up to get behind the scenes now. Once again, that's patreon.com/MBOM yoga to get all the exclusive behind the scenes content. I'll see you there. Hello, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the M.B.Om podcast. I'm really excited that you're joining me for today's episode of the show. This episode is brought to you by OfferingTree, an all-in-one, easy-to-use online business platform that I've been working with for years. If you're looking to save time, energy, and money, make sure you check out OfferingTree. And don't forget to grab your special discount at OfferingTree.com/MBOM. I'll tell you a bit more about OfferingTree and why I think this is an amazing software for yoga teachers. But before we dive into that, let's get to today's episode of the show. This week on the podcast, I'm really excited to be joined by Gary Leinwand. He is an insurance broker with Arthur J. Gallagher, and Arthur J. Gallagher is the company that I've used for my own personal insurance for years and years, and they're one of my top recommendations for insurance for yoga teachers, and specifically for Canadian yoga teachers. So you've heard me talk about other different companies and insurance on the podcast before, but B-Yogi, another partner that I work with who is actually owned by Arthur J. Gallagher, doesn't support Canadian yoga teachers. So after working with Gary for years, we decided, why don't we put an episode together that is geared towards Canadians? So in this episode, Gary talks about insurance for Canadian yoga teachers, including why insurance is important, what to look for as a yoga teacher getting insured, what to look for as a yoga studio getting insured, and what yoga teachers need to know about teaching online and how it impacts their yoga business. So this episode is jam-packed with information, and a lot of this is going to be very, very similar, if you're American as well. It's just that Arthur J. Gallagher is going to be a really great option for the Canadians out there. So I hope that you guys enjoy this episode of the show, and without further ado, here is Gary. Welcome to the podcast today, Gary. I'm really excited to have you here with me.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Amanda. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. You've been my insurance, I don't know if broker is the right word or whatnot, helping me with insurance basically since I became a yoga teacher 5-6 years ago. So it's cool to actually connect with you. Can you share with listeners where you're joining us from?
Yeah, I'm actually joining from Halifax, Nova Scotia, just literally right across the road from our harbor, which happens to be the second largest harbor in the planet.
Oh, amazing. I've never been to Halifax before, so I'll have to get there at some point once restrictions go down and whatnot, but it seems like a beautiful city.
Oh, it's an amazing place. Right on the ocean. It's pretty laid back. lots on the go, and it's one of those cities where you can be at work and then 5 minutes later you can be sort of walking on a beach or walking by the ocean. It's quite something.
Amazing. I love that. That definitely sounds like the dream. And I'm excited to chat all things insurance today. I know I've had, other conversations with people who specialize in insurance, but this one's going to be great because you specialize in with Canadians. And I know that one of the questions I always get asked is like, I've partnered with Yogi and people are like, Yogi's great, but like I'm Canadian and they can't sign up with Yogi. So it's really cool to be able to chat with you and hear a bit more about how things work in Canada. But I wanted to start with you just introducing yourself and telling listeners a little bit about how you got into the insurance business and all of that.
All right, that's great. Thanks. So I've been in insurance for the last 20 years. Basically, I ended up in it by a fluke, which is what most people in insurance will end up saying. I was actually working as a vegetarian chef, and long story. My wife was in a horseback riding accident and was going to be off work for a while, and I had to go out and find myself a quote unquote real job at the time. No offense to vegetarian chefs, just it wasn't really leading anywhere at the time, and I ended up in insurance. So that was 20 years ago, and since then, I've moved from a couple of different companies and settled in to be a commercial insurance broker about 12 years ago. So it's pretty cool. And then a little about me. I guess I've got 4 kids, fairly active. Every night I take my dogs down to the park for a swim, and I've been practicing yoga. I guess I went to my first class. This is going to age me pretty badly, but it probably would have been over 20 years ago. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's so interesting to hear that jump from like being a vegetarian chef to getting insurance. And obviously, you've really enjoyed it since you've been doing it for the last 20 years. At what point did you start working like more specifically in the yoga industry with yoga teachers and yoga studios?
So through practicing and my wife being very active in the yoga community about 6 or 7 years ago, she still is, but got to chatting with teachers, and I was talking to a teacher one night, a friend of ours, and she happened to mention that she was having a horribly hard time trying to find insurance that would cover her as a yoga teacher. She could find all sorts of insurance policies, but none of them would actually cover what she needed. So that got me thinking, and then I approached a small group that no longer exists here. There was a small association of yoga teachers in Atlantic, Canada, and asked them about their insurance. And through that, I started actually I did a few like coffee roundtables. I took, assorted teachers out for a coffee and asked people, what is it you need in insurance as a yoga teacher? What is it you're looking for? Like, what would work well for you? And basically the short answer was most of them didn't want to think about insurance, just wanted something easy, something they could do, call their broker, put it in place, not worry about it for, another year. So it was through that and a bunch of meetings that I ended up sort of building a program. And then I approached Yoga Alliance because I knew they didn't have a program in Canada yet. And I worked with them over, would have been about an 8-month period back and forth, sort of to make sure I was meeting all the requirements they had and also making sure that I met all the requirements that all the teachers here said they wanted. And that was about 6 years ago. And then we launched the program. It would have been April 15th, I think 5 years ago at the yoga convention and show in Toronto.
Oh, wow. And so prior to that, it would have been prior to, I guess, 2015, would it have been quite hard for yoga teachers to get good insurance in Canada?
Yeah, well, that was the feedback I got. I honestly had never looked for it, but that was the feedback I got, that they were having a hard time finding any insurance that would cover anything they wanted to do, like hot yoga or working with children, or there weren't a lot of insurance companies and brokers that were familiar with what a yoga class was and what the practice involved. And, there was basically would have been a huge pain and a hassle to make sure they could cover everything they wanted to cover.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really cool that you were able to spearhead that. And were you working with Arthur J. Gallagher at the time with this program, or were you working with someone else?
No, I've been with Gallagher the whole time.
Okay, awesome. And they were really responsive to setting up a new program and that type of thing?
Yeah, so Gallagher was. So Gallagher we're the brokerage. The insurance company that I use, it's basically all underwritten by Lloyd's of London, which is the world's oldest insurance company. They've been around for 350 years, so they're not going anywhere. They're nice and flexible, and the underwriters I work with out of the Lloyd's basically brokerage in Toronto that I work with are great people and really flexible and seem to have an understanding of yoga. So it was, yeah, they were super keen on it. It was especially looking at the numbers and how many yoga teachers there were. And at the time, yoga was really starting to take off and grow here in Canada. So,
Yeah, that's so interesting to hear. I didn't realize, I guess, that that's been so recent to be able to get like a good, I guess, insurance program going. And I'm curious, like, how hard is it or how challenging is it to like set up a new type of program? Like, how challenging was it to work with Yoga Alliance to actually get this set up in a way that was like functional for yoga teachers?
yeah, so Yoga Alliance was great to work with. They really did look out for their members and their teachers, and they had a very sort of stringent list of requirements and how easy the process had to be and coverages that had to be included and limits and things like that, which luckily were all things I wanted to include and work with as well. Um, so it wasn't that easy. I had a big list of things. Yoga Alliance had a big list of things, and insurance companies by nature are very conservative. So as I'm asking for things, they're sort of pushing back or they want to charge more for things, and it took a lot of massaging and discussions to get them to understand that things weren't as risky as they seemed. Doing children's yoga, often insurance companies are scared of doing anything with children because there's no real limitation on how long they can come back and claim for injuries, and parents can claim for injuries. And if somebody does get injured in a class, it can affect them for a long time. So there was a lot of sort of things we had to work around, discuss, and sort of, as a broker, my job is to get the insurance companies to want to do things. So I was pretty enthusiastic about the whole thing. Funny because I always tell a story that a lot of the time when I was sort of going back and forth, it was about an 8-month process between Yoga Alliance, the insurance company, and myself. And there was a lot of phone calls and texts and emails, and a lot of it I did in the evening sometimes. So I'd be working off my phone, emailing back and forth to the underwriter of things I want to cover. And I sent an email one day that said, and sometimes when I'm rushing around, I was watching a hockey practice at the time. I leave out commas, and I said, we need to make sure we cover, was it hot aerial partner prenatal yoga? And I didn't put in any commas. And I got back an email that said, sorry, there is no chance we're going to cover hot partner aerial prenatal yoga, period. And it took me a second. I'm like, oh, I really need to cover all those modalities. Then I realized that they actually thought I was asking to cover a hot prenatal aerial yoga class, period. So, so basically, that's pretty much one of the only modalities our policy won't cover. But there's not many people, holding aerial hot prenatal yoga classes, thankfully.
I would hope not. It doesn't seem very pregnancy safe.
No, definitely a bad idea. So I'll say basically all modalities are covered under our program. If you are opting to hold a hot aerial prenatal yoga class, it's not covered.
Okay, good to know. Nobody emailed Gary asking for that. They're not going to cover that. I love that story. And so maybe we can dive into a little bit about insurance, because I think this is one of those things that's taught in yoga teacher trainings. Yoga teachers kind of come out certified, recognizing that they need to have insurance. And I think for a lot of people, this can be like the first time where you need insurance for something other than maybe like travel insurance or your bank saying like, hey, there's life insurance on your card. Do you want to keep that? So maybe we can talk a little bit about like why insurance is important for yoga teachers.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great subject. And you're right. For most of the people that I talk to, this is their first time purchasing themselves insurance above and beyond their car, tenants insurance, or you're right, some travel insurance. So it is really important because what it does is it protects the teacher financially. So, and I don't want to use scare tactics or whatnot. That's not really what I do. And I know up here in Canada, we're not as litigious as they are in the US. So I'm not talking about like those crazy lawsuits where somebody like stubs their toe in your class and comes after you for $10 million or that type of thing. But unfortunately, injuries do happen. We have had claims for injuries. People can hurt their neck, or one of the injuries that we have seen was somebody adjusted somebody while in pigeon, it hurt their hip, and the person wasn't able to work for a few weeks. So, that person who can't work for a few weeks, luckily they had benefits through their work. They had short-term disability. Their disability company paid for them to take the few weeks because they couldn't sit at work. But then the disability company actually reached out to the insurance company and said, we paid this person for 3 to 4 weeks of their work. It looks like you're liable for this, so please send us a check. So, that type of thing can happen. And if you don't have insurance, well, first of all, a couple things. When that happens, your insurance company steps in and defends you. If you did something negligent, they'll pay those damages. If you didn't do something negligent, they're not going to pay the damages, but they're still going to pay your legal fees and protect you. Now, that's all subject to wordings in the actual situation. But so that's important, right? Because, as you're a yoga teacher and by yourself, it can be a little intimidating to receive a letter from a lawyer or, the legal department of an insurance company or looking for you to pay them for something. It's nice to have an insurance company to protect you. Plus, if somebody actually is injured, like, I don't know, for example, you're doing an arm balance or headstand class and somebody injures their neck severely and can't work for the next 10 or 15 years, that can be a pretty huge financial hit to the injured person. And the yoga teacher can be held financially responsible for that. So even if you don't have the money there to pay, they can go after your assets or your basically your wages or your salary, for the future. So the insurance policy is there to protect you financially. It also protects the people in your class because, again, if somebody is injured, you've got insurance in case they need to go after, your policy for the injury. Plus, it allows you sometimes to use spaces that you might not be able to use without the insurance. Like, we get calls all the time from people that want to host a class in a park, and municipalities won't let you host a class in the park without proof of insurance. People rent church basements or studio spaces or things like that. You generally can't do that unless you have insurance to protect you.
Yeah, thanks for explaining all of that. And that definitely makes a lot of sense. And I think that it's just one of those things where it's like, okay, it might be really unlikely that something happens in your class. But, I have heard of people who have been accidentally, like it's never on purpose, but accidentally injured in yoga classes. And I just can't even imagine like what it would feel like to have that happen in your class and then worry about if you are, like you said, going to get some sort of a letter or have to pay something just because you're not covered. So I feel like it's that type of thing that's very much worth it to just pay up front because the expense of it is a lot less upfront than it would be if something happened.
Well, our policies, and again, I don't know others, but ours specifically start around $200 a year. I don't think you get a lawyer to respond to something for $200 for the first hour. So it pays for itself pretty quickly. But just one thing I should just clarify though is because I guess we get asked a lot. So if somebody's injured, is my policy just going to pay them? So I just want to make sure your policy may not pay. I sort of touched on this a moment ago, but your policy may not pay somebody for what they're looking for from you, but your policy is still going to defend you. So what I mean by that is, if you didn't do anything negligent, you're not financially responsible to the person who became injured or damaged somehow. But people can come after you whether you're responsible or not, and that's where your policy comes in useful to defend you. What I mean by that, for example, years ago, I went to a hot yoga Jivamukti class, and it was pretty extreme. It was to hip hop music. It was one breath, one movement in a 100 and something degree room. And while I was waiting to go in, somebody else arrived off the street to do a drop in. And I remember the teacher saying to the person, have you done lots of yoga before? Because this is a pretty advanced class. And the person said, no, I'm in good shape, though. Don't worry about it. I've never done a yoga class. And the teacher said, well, maybe you should come back. Like next hour, we have an all levels, or the hour after that, we have like a flow class. And those might be a little more suitable than a 104 degree room, one breath, one movement to hip hop class as your introduction to yoga. So had that person insisted on going into that class and injured themselves and, had to miss work or had a heart attack or dehydrated and was off work for a little while and came after the yoga studio did everything correct by saying, this isn't suitable for you. So their policy would defend them, but they're not going to pay for that person's injuries, right? So as opposed to if, I'm in a class and I say to the teacher, look, I've never done an arm balance. I've never done a headstand. I've never done crow or whatever. And, just do it. You can do it, and really pressures me and makes me do it. And then they say I fall at a crow and smash all my teeth and I end up with a $40,000 dental bill, which I know people are probably thinking that seems extreme, but I don't think it is if you lose all your teeth or your front teeth.
Yeah. Dental's expensive.
Well, exactly. So that type of thing, as long as it wasn't maliciously done, like the teacher or the studio was negligent, so the policy would most likely respond and pay that person's dental medical bill. So hopefully my little tangent there just made sense.
Yeah, for sure. I guess I'm curious with that. One thing is so I guess we need to be quite cautious to know what our policy does cover, because I'm assuming there are things that your policy might not cover you for. Are there any instances where somebody can get injured in your class and your policy is no, we do not cover this?
Well, so again, I can only speak to our program specifically and our policy specifically. So again, it depends on what your policy is going to respond, pay your defense bills. They may not pay the other person, but that's a great question and really important because people really do need to know what they're covered for. A lot of policies won't cover hot yoga, or a lot of policies may not cover children's yoga or aerial yoga. So unless they ask or they know that, somebody may suddenly find themselves in a situation where they thought they had coverage, but they didn't. So it's pretty important to know what your policy covers. So, and everyone's different. I guess, our policy, as I mentioned earlier, I built it to cover as many modalities as we possibly could. So that sort of will encompass more things. But yeah, there could be lots of examples where people think they have coverage and they don't. As I said, I know I've had people call me and say, my current policy will not cover a hot yoga class. So things like that.
Hey everyone, we're just taking a quick break from the podcast to talk about OfferingTree. I wanted to remind you about the special discount you can get with OfferingTree. I love telling yoga teachers about OfferingTree because not only is it your one-stop shop for all things that you need in your yoga business, but it is also easy to use, it's affordable, and it's truly an amazing company to work with. OfferingTree lets you sell courses, run classes, manage memberships, and so much more with just one account. That's right, just one login for all those parts of your business. One of the best parts about OfferingTree is their online store. You can sell digital content like yoga videos, challenges, and courses right from your website. If you're teaching yoga classes and looking to level up, selling digital content is the next step to growing your business. Over the last year, we've seen so much pivot and change happen in the yoga industry, and having your own unique yoga business where you offer your students different course material can be so beneficial in creating a sustainable business with diversified income. And while there's many different platforms that you can create courses on these days, OfferingTree's course tools are easy to use and they're really affordable. And if you have a website you already like, you can still use OfferingTree. But there's one other thing I want to tell you about OfferingTree that makes all the difference in the world to me and probably to you too. They're a company that truly cares about yoga teachers and the wellness industry overall. I chose to partner with OfferingTree because I love the product and I love the people. Whenever yoga teachers have a suggestion for something that they need out of the platform, they can reach out directly to the people at OfferingTree and they're actually heard. So much of the development that OfferingTree has gone through over the last year has been because of yoga teachers like yourself. So if you're looking to save time, energy, and money in your yoga business, OfferingTree is hands down the software for you. Go to offeringtree.com/M.B.Om to learn more and get your discount. Okay, let's get back to the episode. Yeah. One of the things I always recommend to yoga teachers is just to, talk to somebody like yourself when they're getting set up for insurance. Don't just buy something online, or if you're going to, just make sure you do talk to somebody to let them know, here's what I'm actually doing in my business. Am I covered through this policy, just so that because I feel like it does, I feel like, travel insurance is one that comes to mind for me just because I travel quite a bit and, you need to make sure that you're covered for certain things. I got my purse stolen a month or two ago in Mexico City, and I don't have the regular plan I normally have because it can't be covered right now with the rules for Canadians and stuff leaving the country. And the one that I have doesn't cover like any theft. So I messaged them like, hey, is there anything you can do for me with this? And they're like, no, sorry, we don't cover that. So even though I do have travel insurance, like they couldn't help me out at all when somebody like stole my bag. So I think it is important like to know what you're actually covered for. So you're not just assuming like, oh, they're covering me regardless of what happens and that type of thing.
Exactly. So the good news with our program is a lot of that's all on my webpage, and it says what's covered, what isn't covered, but I'm always available as well. But, a couple of things that, teachers should really look for. It's always nice to have a broker or company that actually knows yoga. Like that's hugely important, because if you're trying to sort out if things are covered, or, if you want to do Ashtanga classes or yoga nidra, and you're talking to somebody that has no idea what any of these things are, they're not really going to be able to know if you're covered or not. Plus, they may not really understand the risks that they're trying to insure. Like a lot of people have come to me only have what's called a general liability policy. It covers slip and fall type stuff, and don't know that their policy is not actually covering them for issues that may occur while they're teaching a class. So yeah, so it's really important to look for a broker that knows yoga. Make sure your policy is comprehensive, should be flexible and simple. Like, one of the big things with our policy is you don't have to list out all the modalities that you want to practice, because, and I get asked this question all the time. Well, my policy doesn't say I'm covered for hot yoga or prenatal yoga. Well, that's good, because if you list things that are covered, you're leaving coverage off for things that you don't list. Hopefully that makes sense. Like, it's better to just have, like, our policy says all modalities of yoga, which is much more comprehensive than me trying to list off any potential type of yoga that exists, because there's so many different modalities and forms and class formats that if you miss listing something, in theory, it wouldn't be covered if your policy is based on listing everything. So, and
Yeah,
then,
no,
you want to,
for sure.
but yeah, and you want to watch for silly little sort of, coverage limitations as well. Like, I know somebody sent me a copy of their policy last year that limited hot yoga to 103.5 degrees. Like, how, if you've been in a hot
So
yoga room, it
yeah,
can
so if it's
go
at
between.
104, then they're just not covered.
Well, and how would an insurance company or a claims adjuster ever figure out what the temperature was at the time? All it's doing is leaving room for arguments and discussions and potential issues. But we see stuff like that all the time. And again, in a yoga hot room, that depending on the humidity level and the fan coming on or off, it can be between 101, or it can hit 106 or 108 degrees. And, having something stupid in there, like, limited to 103.5, really just leaves room for fighting and arguing and disagreement if something goes wrong.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And so when yoga teachers are looking for insurance, they just want to like, what specifically should they be looking for? Because I feel like for a lot of them, they're kind of like, I just want to teach classes.
Well, so that's where, again, somebody like me in our program is great, because my whole program was built around that philosophy. And those yoga teachers years ago said, I don't really care about my insurance. I just want easy and affordable. But if you're going to start digging into specifics, a big thing is what's called an occurrence-based policy. So what an occurrence-based policy means is, if your policy runs for, let's say, the whole calendar year, and something goes wrong during that calendar year, it doesn't matter when the claim is brought to your attention. So, I could injure myself in your class and not realize that injury was caused by the class. But, a couple of months after the policy expires, I go to the doctor, the chiropractor, the osteopath, whoever you use. And they say, well, geez, something's out of line here in your hip. Any idea what happened? And, oh, maybe it was that yoga class. So I decide to go back and sort of go after the yoga teacher for this injury, but my policy's expired. That doesn't matter, because the incident occurred while my policy was in force. So if your policy is in force now, even if you cancel it and I come back like 2 years from now and say that, you injured me during this class, your policy will still respond even though it's expired, because the loss or the claim or the injury or whatever we're going to call it happened while your policy was in force. So that's hugely important. The other one I sort of touched on, there's two types of coverage that our policy includes. The first one's called commercial general liability. And what that is slip and fall type insurance, or insurance if you damage the space you're using. So, somebody trips and falls and hurts themselves walking into your class, or, you're using a studio space that belongs to somebody else and somebody leaves a shower running or a sink running and it does water damage. That's commercial general liability. But the other part is basically called professional liability, which also is known as errors and omissions. And that's the part that covers you as an actual yoga teacher. So that would be, as I said, the example of, adjusting somebody in pigeon that hurts their hip, or, giving bad instruction to somebody in the class and it causes an injury. If you don't have professional liability or errors and omission, same thing, the terms used, in theory, you might not be covered for an injury that I won't say you cause, but that happens in your class. So you want to make sure your policy is occurrence-based, and also the professional liability is part of it, not just general liability.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's great. And that's sort of a really quick summary. Like, these are things that you can write entire textbooks on.
I'm sure. Amazing. I'm curious. So you mentioned before, like the slip and fall policy and stuff. Is that often the type of policy that a yoga studio would have as opposed to like a yoga teacher?
So basically, when you're a yoga studio, it becomes a whole different sort of scope of insurance. So the studio will always have, sorry, let me just go back a second here. The individual teachers should have that general liability as well in case they damage a space they're using or in case somebody trips or slips coming to their class. But in terms of studios, there's two important sections of their coverage. So we'll start with the liability because that's what we've been discussing. So the general liability will cover them for slip and fall incidents. It'll cover them for if they don't own the space and they're leasing the space, they'll have coverage in there for any damage that may get caused to the space that they're leasing. I shouldn't say any damage, it depends on the policy. Like the general liability slip and fall type stuff. Somebody falls down the stairs, somebody spilled water and they slip and fall, that type of thing. The professional liability as well will cover the owner. But a big thing that I bump into with studio owners and individual teachers. So oftentimes I'll have an individual teacher come to me and say, I'm covered while I teach at a studio. And I always say, well, go back and make sure you're covered, not the studio's covered for you, which I'll explain a little more. So basically say I'm working at your studio and somebody gets injured in my class. So that injured person is going to claim against the studio and me. So oftentimes the studio's policy only covers the studio and the studio owner for the liability associated with having a teacher or a contractor working for them. But that independent contractor who's working at the studio is probably not going to have coverage. So they're covered. So hopefully that makes sense. The studio is protected for having the teacher working for them, but that individual teacher or independent contractor, they could be stuck holding, all the expenses and the claim on their own unless they have a policy. So there's sort of two. Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Like I said, so there's two approaches there. Sometimes studios will opt to include all the teachers that will be teaching for them, and they'll typically pay to do that, or they'll pay more to do that, or they'll cover themselves, the owners and like the partners, and then they'll cover what's called the vicarious liability of having the contractors. So that's the part if contractor injures somebody, the studio's covered for whatever claim arrives, but the teacher isn't.
Right. That makes sense. I think this is one of the things too that I think sometimes yoga teachers get confused about because they're like, oh, well, the studio has insurance. So like, I don't need my own insurance. Like I only teach at studios. And I always tell yoga teachers, like, make sure you're talking with the studio owner to see if there is any coverage for you because you should be holding your own insurance in case something happens in your class. So I do feel like having those conversations with studio owners and then also just having your own insurance is a really good practice.
Well, that's just it. And not only having the discussion with the studio owner, because what I keep bumping into is the studio owners often legitimately think all of their teachers are covered because it's a pretty fine point. Like even I get confused when I was just explaining what I did, explain a second ago, like, the vicarious liability is covered. So the teacher comes in and says, "Am I covered?" The studio owner says, "Yes, you're covered." But no, the individual teacher is not really covered. The studio is covered for whatever may happen. And then a lot of times they'll call their brokers. And this is where I say it's good to have a broker that's familiar with yoga and really familiar with the policy and the program. Because often the brokers will say, "Oh, yeah, you're covered for the teachers," or "Yeah, your teachers are covered," but not really making the distinction there between, like, under that policy, is the teacher's, defense costs or potential, financial liability covered? Because oftentimes it really isn't. And there's a lot of confusion out there. And I've had studio owners call me and say, "Oh, no, I'm covered for all my teachers. I include their coverage." Go back and really dig. And a week later, they'll be like, "Oh my God, thank God I spoke to you," because I just found out I wasn't. So it's really important, and it can get a little complex. So that's where, again, it's important to really know what you're covered for, especially as a studio owner. So
Yeah.
then there's a whole other section, of course, when you own a studio. There's what's called property insurance. So that would be to cover you against things like fire, water damage, sewer backup. And that would cover, a lot of people don't realize that the leasehold improvements, the money they put in, they should insure that, because if something does happen, if the building burns down or a roof collapses, the landlord or the owner of the building's insurance isn't going to pay you back for the money you put in for the leasehold improvements, as well as your contents that you have in there. And then also a big part would be business interruption, and contingency planning. So, you put all this time and money and built yourself a beautiful studio, and the sewer backs up into it and it's going to be shut down for 3 months, or the roof collapses or fire or whatever, and you're shut down for 3 months. If you don't have business interruption, you're not getting any revenue for that 3 months. If you have business interruption coverage, in theory, you can go out and rent a church basement or another studio space and keep your classes going, or at least you'll have money coming in. You'll have your revenue protected, and keep getting paid for the few months while you're sorting things out and getting yourself started again.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely something good to keep in mind. That's not something that I would have just intuitively thought about. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, well, we have seen, some other claims. Like, it's interesting. We had one of the first claims I had years ago in the insurance program was a teacher had leased a space to do a chair yoga class, and one of the, I guess, little felt things on the bottom where the chairs had come off, and did some pretty decent scratching on the epoxy cover on some cork flooring. So what I didn't realize is, with the cork flooring, once you scratch off a little part and a little bit of moisture gets in, it basically ruined the whole entire surface flooring. They couldn't just put new epoxy or surface cover on it. They actually had to take it all off and replace the floor. It ended up being about $4,000 worth of flooring. So, it's important to make sure you have the insurance.
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely makes sense. And then something I'd love to chat about, because I feel like this has been, I guess, massive throughout this entire pandemic, is teaching yoga online. I know you guys were like completely overwhelmed with people adding online yoga to their policies and that type of thing. And the companies trying to add different types of online yoga to their policies. But can we talk a little bit about, like, what we need to know about insurance when it comes to teaching online?
Yeah, for sure. That's actually a great subject. I'll try not to have any crazy flashbacks from that first weekend of the COVID shutdown.
Oh my God, I'm sure you have some trauma.
Oh, it's funny because it actually, we were watching an NBA game when everything started to shut down. It was like March 18th last year. And I remember thinking this is drastically going to impact all of my yoga teachers. But before anybody even reached out to me, I reached out to the insurance company and said, "Look, I have a feeling we're about to see everything shut down. This is going to be completely overwhelming. Can we just add online coverage for everybody who's insured with us until," I said for the year for free. They came, of course, pushed back, and we ended up settling on May 31st or June 1st. So basically, before I'd even been contacted by anybody, I made an arrangement with the insurance company that anybody that asked, we would cover no charge between the shutdown, which was around March 18th, I think, until May 31st. Because at that point, we didn't know if it was going to be 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We certainly didn't think it was going to be 18 to 24 months. And we just needed to make sure our teachers all could keep going if they wanted to. And I sent out an email to every single one of my insurance clients, yoga teachers, on that. That was a Wednesday. On that Friday night, it said, look, here's what we can do, but you need to tell me you want this because I have to add you. I had no idea the response I was going to get. I literally spent 14 hours a day for 3 days locked in my basement office. There was no process set up for it. There was no online portal. I had to manually look through every email I got, dig out the person's policy number and name and put them all onto an Excel spreadsheet and send them every evening to the insurance company. And it probably went on for about a week and a half. And it was, but I was able to get everybody covered, and it bought everybody a couple of months of time to sort out what they were going to do. And it was great. But in terms of, the first thing I would say about live, online coverage, and don't assume you're covered. I know I've gotten calls from other people who have assumed they had the coverage with other insurance programs or even with us, and it wasn't covered. Because prior to COVID, I literally only had 1 or 2 teachers out of my entire group of teachers that I insure that had online coverage. Nobody else cared about it. And at that point, it was, to add it, it was $250 a year. There was only 1 or 2. But once COVID happened, I realized that's kind of an outrageous amount. And, we should probably look at that and try and make it more affordable, because all of a sudden everybody's going to need it. So I was actually able to negotiate it down to $50 for the year to add it to people's policies after that June 1st date. Again, we still covered it for free for that first couple of months, just while we sorted things out. So, yeah,
Wow,
so definitely. Yeah. Then a couple things to really consider, though, when you add online coverage. So a big one and a big question I get asked is, where do the participants have to be? So I can only speak to ours, but we're okay if the participants in your class are anywhere in the world, because that's kind of one of the benefits of being online is your students can be anywhere. So that's something to make sure of, because I know there's a couple of other providers out there with online coverage that have some pretty stringent requirements that I think are unrealistic. I won't go into too many details, but there's no way to make sure your participants are all within Canada. So having an online policy that restricts you to participants in Canada is somewhat silly. So in ours will cover you. So, and again, you want to make sure as well, there's a couple other things like, are you covered for live classes and pre-recorded classes? Do you have to be able to see your participants? What platforms are you going to be covered in? And does your insurance company want you to have waivers signed by everybody? And if so, how are you going to go about doing that if everybody's online?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to think about when it comes to the new online world. And I feel like, especially like if we think March of 2020, I feel like people were just teaching in whatever capacity they could, like Facebook Lives, Instagram Lives, free classes, just hop on Zoom. And there's just so many things that you need to consider when it comes to insurance and like the legal side of it. And it seems like a lot of people are pretty like solid in the way that they're doing their online portion of their business now that we've been doing this for a while. But I do think it is important to make sure, just kind of like we were talking about before, like letting your broker know or your agent know, like, this is what I'm doing in my business. I think it's super important to let people know, like, if you are teaching online in some capacity.
Yeah, so I can't remember if you were insured with me at the time, but I sent out an updated email basically every week throughout the first 4 months of the pandemic, just keeping people in the loop, sort of, because we had the free coverage till May 31st, but then people were wondering what was going to happen. So as I was negotiating with the insurance companies on what we were going to do after May 31st, I kept everybody up to date. And I wanted to make sure people weren't worried about things, because I was able to negotiate, and I can only speak to our program again. But ours will cover live classes, pre-recorded classes on any platform, and we don't have a waiver requirement. It's nice to have a waiver running at the bottom of the class before it starts. It said, you're responsible for your own actions, etc. But asking our teachers to go out and get a signed waiver or a signed form from everybody that's going to be in the class is completely prohibitive. It doesn't make any sense. And same with platforms, right? There's so many out there that by not listing specific platforms, we're going to cover them all. So it's Facebook Live, Instagram Live, a Zoom class, whatever. And we're good with the live and pre-recorded as well. So, which is really quite beneficial. It allows my teachers who are insured with me to go about and run the business the way they want to, and to try to maximize the amount of people they can reach with their classes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great that you're able to cover the live classes for participants being anywhere in the world. I know that that was one thing that I heard from some teachers that they weren't getting coverage for, and that was a bit challenging. And then also to have the coverage for like the live and the pre-recorded, because I think that, so many people are just hitting record on their classes and putting it in an on-demand library for their members to look at later, maybe for them to resell or something. So it's nice to know that you're just, if you've got that online coverage with you guys, that you're just covered.
Yeah, it's been great, and plus, thankfully, it took a while, but we were able to add it to like our online process, because my whole program is based out of a website that people can go on. They log on, they answers all the questions, they can get the quotes on what they're looking for, and actually just purchase the policy all in one, 10-minute, 20-minute, however long it takes them, and then they're instantly emailed all their documents. Prior to us adding the question about online coverage, every time somebody needs the online coverage, I have to manually add it, send them a bill, and the whole bit. So now it's all just built right into our buy the policy or renew the policy system, which is great. At least great for me.
No, yeah. To be honest. I mean, I'm sure it's great for like people as well. Like I think that, as little touch points as possible is probably just a lot easier for getting it figured out.
Yeah, for sure. Because generally people are going to buy the policy, and then they don't want to have to then email me to add something, and then I have to send them a document and an invoice, and then they have to sort out how to pay for it. It's made things much easier, which is nice.
No, that's great to hear. That's really awesome. And so I know we've kind of been talking a lot about insurance and the program. Can you tell people a little bit more about Arthur J. Gallagher and just what the policy looks like and where they can go to find that?
Yeah, so Gallagher, actually, we're one of the largest insurance brokerage and risk management companies in the world. But still, our CEO is still part of the Gallagher family, and our culture is still that of a small brokerage. Even though we are large and we're publicly traded, our attitude is help our clients, be there for our clients, and service. So it's amazing. It's the company I worked for was acquired by Gallagher 5 or 6 years ago, and there's been no change in the culture. And if anything, it's amazingly positive. Like I'm on a first name basis with our CEO, and the management's incredible, and all the people here, all have the goal of making things the best they can for our clients. So in terms of where to find me, basically the best is you can go through either and I guess hopefully I was clear at the beginning. Our program is a membership benefit for Yoga Alliance, the international organization. So you do have to be a member of Yoga Alliance to access our program. But Yoga Alliance also has lots of great benefits, and I keep sending people there for help with waivers. And I know they put out lots of great documents and things like that for and webinars and town halls about reopening after COVID. But anyways, they can take. So basically, you can either access us through the members benefits page at Yoga Alliance, or I have my own website, which you can www.A as in Apple, J as in Jonathan, G as in Gary.com/yoga. Or if you just Google Yoga Alliance Insurance Program Canada, I should pop up.
Amazing. That's great to hear. I'll make sure there's links to all of that. Gary, this has been so great. Is there any last things you want to share with myself and listeners before we wrap up?
Well, first, I really want to thank you for letting me come on and do this. It's great, and for the service you're providing to all of your listeners. It's amazing. But basically, all I say is, if you're a yoga teacher, just make sure you have the right policy for yourself. Really look into it and make sure you're covered for everything that you need. And I can't reiterate enough how important it is to make sure your broker and the insurance company actually understand yoga and the practice of yoga. So that would be about it.
Amazing. Yeah, that's an important one, and I think a great place to wrap this up. So thank you so much for your time today and for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure to connect with you.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been really enjoyable speaking with you as well. And thank you to your listeners for listening.
All right, friends, I hope that you enjoyed that episode of the podcast with Gary Leinwand from Arthur J. Gallagher, and that you learned a lot all about insurance and why it is so important to have insurance as yoga teachers. We do not have a bonus episode on behind the scenes this week, but we're making up for it with a special bonus episode we've got a little bit later on in the month, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, I just wanted to say a huge shout out and thank you to our sponsor, OfferingTree. To start spending more time with students and less time with software, head on over to offeringtree.com/M.B.Om to get your exclusive discount and get started today. And of course, a huge thank you to you, the listener of the show. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the podcast, and I will see you next week. Bye for now. Thank you so much for tuning in for this episode of the podcast. To find links, notes, resources, and everything mentioned in today and all episodes of the show, you can head on over to mbomyoga.com. You can find the podcast and myself on Facebook and social media at Mastering the Business of Yoga. And I would love for you to join the private Facebook community, Yoga Business Badasses. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please make sure you reach out to me at info@mbomyoga.com. And last of all, if you enjoyed this episode of the show, please make sure you hit subscribe and leave a review for the podcast. It would mean the world. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Namaste.